¿Qué tal, queridos hijos e hijas de la noche? Bienvenidos sean a un episodio más de Monstruoso Podcast. El episodio de hoy es muy especial porque tenemos a un invitado de lujo que, desde que platicamos en el canal de El Ojo de Horus con mi amigo Antonio Cobos, muchos de ustedes me habían estado pidiendo que lo trajera al canal y lo entrevistara yo solo para poder preguntarle todo lo que quería preguntarle, y aquí está. Con ustedes la entrevista que le hice a Dacre Stoker hace unos días, bueno, para mí ya pasaron varios días, respecto al enigma de Drácula y cómo su autor, Bram Stoker, tío bisabuelo del señor Dacre Stoker, afirmó durante toda su vida que Drácula fue una historia real. Finalmente pude hacerle de frente muchas preguntas, muchas dudas que tenía sobre este caso que he abordado incluso en otros canales como en Podcast Paranormal. Si ustedes me conocieron por mi colaboración con Fepo a finales del año pasado, tal vez escucharon cuando hablé de este enigma del que no tanta gente sabe en ese podcast, y mucha gente le gustó el caso y lo han estado siguiendo. Yo lo he estado investigando en las fuentes que se pueden, en las fuentes que ha sido tocado, y la persona que más ha tocado, que más sabe sobre todo esto, porque él tiene acceso a las cartas y diarios personales de Bram Stoker, fue precisamente Dacre Stoker. Así que le pude hacer muchas preguntas y muchas dudas que tenía al respecto. El episodio está subtitulado en inglés, obviamente, porque el señor solamente habla inglés, pero veré la forma de doblarlo o hacer algo para poder subirlo en algún momento a Spotify. Sin embargo, por el momento disfruten de esta primera parte, porque Dacre Stoker y yo quedamos en que vamos a grabar una segunda parte hablando de otros enigmas que nos quedaron en el tintero. Así que, sin más que decir, disfruten de este episodio y vamos a responder este enigma de Bram Stoker, diciendo durante toda su vida que Drácula era una historia basada en hechos reales y que Drácula en realidad existió. Vamos con el episodio. Hola, ¿qué tal, queridos hijos e hijas de la noche? ¿Cómo están? Espero se encuentren muy bien. Hoy estamos de manteles largos porque está aquí con nosotros una persona, una figura que hemos mencionado muchísimo y que es un honor para mí que esté aquí, el señor Dacre Stoker, sobrino bisnieto de Bram Stoker, y vamos a estar hablando no de la novela de Drácula como pieza de arte, sino como el enigma que hemos estado tocando en el canal desde hace ya año y medio. Así que este señor es la pieza fundamental de esta investigación y es un honor y un privilegio que esté aquí con nosotros, porque él es quien ha ido desentrañando todo este enigma del cual hemos estado hablando desde hace un año. Entonces vamos a dar inicio con esta entrevista. Mr. Dacre Stoker, how are you?
I'm very well, and thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure for me to be here today.
Thank you, and it's our honor for us. We had already talked in the past with Antonio in the Ojo de Horus channel, so thank you that you accepted to be here. Well, we are a little short on time, but we're gonna make it worth. So first of all, I always start this podcast with two questions to my guests. The first one, well, I would like you to talk to us a little bit about yourself, about your work as an author, and a little bit of investigator and researcher that you have been doing in the past years.
Yes, so it sort of started more as me being the investigator, interested in my family background, and then what happened is that drew me into writing. So this is sort of what happened. I was contacted by a screenwriter, Ian Holt, who said, look, I've got this idea of a screenplay and it hasn't done very well, hasn't gone anywhere as a screenplay. I think maybe it'd be good as a book, but I'd really like to have a member of the Stoker family involved. Are you interested? Because he'd seen on the internet that I've done a lot of varied things, from being a school teacher, an Olympic athlete, Olympic coach. And he thought, well, maybe you've got some interest in doing something else, sort of crazy. What do you know about the family? And I said, look, right now, I know a fair amount, but I don't have enough knowledge base to get involved as a writer. But something interesting just happened. My uncle, who is my father's brother, my dad had died many years ago, and the final relative of the family, who is that older generation, Uncle Paddy Stoker, he knew that me and my wife were very interested in genealogy, and he'd been giving us information this is how old it was, by fax machine, things that he had found. And he said, listen, I've just been diagnosed with a heart condition. I think it's a good idea for you to fly up to Montreal, Canada. I was living in South Carolina where I am at the time. And I'd like to pass to you all the secrets, all the things I know. And bring your scanner, bring your computer. So long story short, that 4-day stretch, I learned more about the family, all the connections, letters back and forth. And that brought me way up to speed on all the people in the family. Now, Bram Stoker is my great-grand-uncle. His youngest brother is my great-grandfather. Of 7 children in the family, only 3 had offspring. Only 2 have offspring alive today. So it's a big family, but not many people left. So it wasn't difficult to find all the letters between them and the stories back and forth. So once I got all that information in my head, on my computer, and a much better idea where to look in certain libraries for the Dracula notes, Bram was the first one I went to. My great-grandfather was the second because he was a famous doctor. Then I went back to Ian Holt about 2 years later and said, I'm now ready to get into writing. I might need some help. And he said, no problem, we can get good editors. What I need is your raw ideas, storytelling, what goes on in your family, and what inspired Bram Stoker. What did you know about Bram that we can put into a novel? And that's what started the whole idea of getting published. Dracula the Undead in 2009 became an international bestseller. So that's really what got me going. And that just spurred me on. Things that I learned at that beginning when I went to these different libraries, museums, private archives. I've got like a treasure chest of information, and I keep using that to write stories, and usually with co-authors that have better writing skills than me, but need all my information to help tell the story our way.
Okay, so it's very interesting because I was going to go ahead with this a little bit further in the episode, but now you have told us. So all this enigma about Dracula and what it seems to be lived by Bram Stoker so many years ago was like a family secret that only a few knew, and it goes from generation to generation.
Well, some of the things do. Okay, so here's what the public knows, and here's where the documents are. So if there's anybody on the podcast that wants to learn some of these secrets, you go to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, USA. That's where the 125 pages of Dracula notes are. Bram Stoker's widow sold those, and where they went in 1914, we don't exactly know. How they ended up in 1962 in the Rosenbach Museum is a secret nobody knows. But they're there. They have been published by Dr. Elizabeth Miller and Robert Basang, so you can get them on Amazon or eBay. You can find these notes. They're a wonderful resource. The Dracula typescript is the actual novel that Bram paid to have somebody type it, gave to his editor, and they both sat down and made editorial changes, cut some things out, added some things. That's owned by the Paul Allen estate, one of the guys that co-founded Microsoft. And that is not easy to see because it's private and they don't normally let people see it. I'm one of 6 people that have been able to analyze it. I did actually, with Robert Basang, publish an edition of Dracula. It's available on Amazon. Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary, which has all of the things cut out of that typescript. So most of that information that the Paul Allen estate owns is somewhat public. You can buy it on Amazon for $20 in paperback. Those 2 things are the most public things about Bram, about Dracula. The private things we're talking about is what was Bram's life like? What made him sick when he was a child? How did he recover as a kid? What was he really like as a person? All those things I found in a journal, secretly hidden in an attic, owned by his great-grandson. I've had that published, called The Last Journal of Bram Stoker. And those things are now more public, but there's still letters and things back and forth and family stories about Bram himself as a person. that I have in my head that I will pass on to my son. But I also combine those with things I find in the journal, the notes, the typescript when I'm writing my stories. Like Dracula, the prequel to Dracula, when Bram is a character, I need to accurately portray him. So these things really help portraying him. What would he say? How would he act? How would he behave? Not just made up, but things based on real fact.
Okay, so because I mean, let's go little by little. I've talked about Dracula, which here in Spanish it's called Dracula el Origen. I've talked about it a lot of times because I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of Dracula, as you can see, since some time ago, because of the movies, and I have memorabilia and all this stuff. But when I read Dracula, written by you and J.D. Baker, is it
Barker?
Barker, sorry. I really fell in love with not only with the story, but with the fact that, you know, it was when I felt like when you watch a horror movie and in the end you have this legend that says based on real facts. I was like, wow. So reading the final note that you leave at the end of the novel, I really got shocked when I was like, okay, so this happened. So I wanted to ask you. Well, let's. The other question that I was going to ask you, that I ask to every person that comes here to the show, is: do you believe in the paranormal? Do you, Dacre Stoker, believe in the paranormal? And does that image or that vision that you have about those things has changed through the time with what you have read and researched throughout the years?
I have always been open-minded about what things we cannot see in a scientific manner. And as I have studied more about Bram Stoker, I've become more enlightened myself about his position, and I realize that we're very similar. And his position on this is kind of summed up in the novel Dracula by saying there are mysteries in life which men may only guess at, which age by age we may solve only in part. It is my favorite quote from the novel, and I now believe that these mysteries that are out there, potential for ghosts or spirits, or some things we cannot quantify, things that we don't necessarily believe because we can't see and touch it, that they could exist. And I say that because it's so obvious that there are so many things that 100 years ago people didn't believe in, electricity and things like that now they believe in, that people would have been, you know, burned at the stake for believing in these things. Modern medicine was witchcraft. So I think as we evolve as people, we'll learn more things as we understand to use our brain more. So yes, I believe the existence of things that we can't see right now, and we could call that the paranormal. Yeah, I think it's out there. And I honestly believe that was a guiding factor in Bram Stoker's life and his writing, not just of Dracula.
Okay, so, well, that's well, we have talked in the past, so I knew a little bit about your position on this topic, but I wanted my audience to know. Thank you for your honesty. I'm on the same page as you, to be honest, because I was kind of even though I have this show talking about paranormal stuff and all these kind of, you know, creatures, appearances and testimonies and all that, I was kind of skeptic when I began here like 4 years ago. I was very, not skeptic, but like very mind closed.
Yeah.
And when as I started, developing, reading more stuff, getting to know people like you or people that have lived these kind of things in person, and this year I had my first paranormal experience with a ghost, or what I believe to be a ghost, in a haunted apartment here. So I have been opening my mind, and I try to put in your position and your families. And my main question is for you, and maybe we can start expanding a little bit. How much is it in Dracula el Origen? How much of it is fiction, and how much of it is real based on what you found on the journals and all these secret and not so very secret files that you had access to?
Well, it's impossible to actually quantify and say, 47% is real. But I will say this: all of the characters that we chose, every single character, with the exception of Count Dracula, are people that you can touch and see and hold and feel. Real people, right? So all of that was done by good research and finding people that existed. Their stories are about 75% real. Arminius Vambury, Ellen Crone, the O'Keefe family. Now, we have changed names a little bit so people don't get their feelings hurt, or if they still have family. Ellen Crone is real. She has no family. And Arminius Vambury is real, and his name is. And he was somebody that I am convinced was a good friend and part of Stoker's circle of people understanding Vlad Dracula and vampirism and all this. So I've also found that Bram was very convinced when he read Emily Gerard's book about Transylvanian superstitions that he was convinced that this was real, and that's why he set the story in Transylvania. So the myth that JD and I based the story on, Dracula as a vampire, even though we altered Ellen Crone's known and complete understanding of her, we adapted her to known Irish vampire mythology, the Derg-du, as well as a character from Dracula's guest, Countess Doligen von Gratz, who was somebody who really existed. So by including real people and backstories, and I'll be delicate to say either people believed in or were real is sometimes a little bit of both, isn't it? So we'll just say that we're believed to be true. That's the essence of our writing. And so there's no clear-cut way that says this is true and this is false. I will also say that Bram's recovery from his childhood illness is something that has weighed heavily on my mind for a long time. And by wondering, and I still don't know the answer, how did Bram go from an invalid for 7 years to a champion athlete 10 years later? It just doesn't seem normal and practical under natural occurrences. So was there some potion that he got from druids, from some doctors, or was there potentially some supernatural intervention that maybe Ellen Crone was responsible for? That's again blurring the edges of fact and fantasy, of reality, natural and supernatural. So that's what makes the story great. That storytelling is you really don't know the difference. What we do know is that Bram did have this difficult childhood. He did have a long and wonderful relationship with Ellen Crone, as did Thornley Stoker. By the way, when I found in Trinity College, when JD and I were there doing our research, the archives contain letters between Ellen Crone and Bram and Thornley, so we could tell how they felt about each other. We also found a collection of hair of Ellen Crone's wrapped up in an envelope for Thornley. And that was, that really was like spooky to us. Like, what still exists? The DNA exists there. Does her spirit exist here? Who knows? But we also know that the people in the Victorian era did things like this because of different beliefs. They took photographs of their dead relatives. They kept lockets of hair in jewelry because they felt part of the person lived on in the parts that they could keep. And you couldn't keep skin because it would decompose, but hair you could keep. So their belief system was, as I say, 127 years old, but they believe those things. And that's why we included these things in in the story. The sister, Matilda, really was an artist, and she was portrayed that way in the novel. She really did go to Paris. We had to have a scene in Paris when she went there looking for evidence, because we know she went there to study art. So the basis for this story, the foundation, like building a house with the foundation, maybe not all the perfect pictures and the rugs and the furnishings were exactly the same, but the foundations of this story were all true.
Okay, that's very interesting, especially about Ellen Cron, because I mean, we could tell, as a fan of Bram Stoker, I am also very, even before knowing about this real life mystery, this enigma, I was always very interested and about how did he become a very ill kid to a super athlete when he was in college. Very physically strong. I mean, you can see it on the paintings that he was a physically strong man, and I've always wondered how did he got there, especially at the time. Maybe nowadays we have a lot of medicine, things and all this stuff, but back there 127 years ago, as you say, they didn't. So it's very enigmatic.
Yeah.
But
it is. I was thinking in my sports career, there would have been steroids, there would have been blood doping, human growth hormone, all this physiotherapy, all these things. But you're right. Back in those days, it was impossible. Yeah.
Sure. And also, but as you read a biography or you watch a documentary on Bram Stoker or whatever, you find out that he was real, that his brother was real, that his sister was real. But when you read the book, you could say Ellen Cron was not real. And then when you told me this, when we were talking with Antonio a couple months ago, some few months ago, and you told me this about the envelope with the hair of Ellen Cron inside the envelope, I was like mind blown, because that means she did exist. And precisely what you were telling about the DNA that's in that hair, maybe if it could be analyzed somehow.
I know. I was telling you, I was thinking there's probably cameras looking. I would like to take a little bit of the hair and send it for analysis to see, But
that would be great.
It would have been very embarrassing. And with all respect, I wouldn't steal it, but I would maybe ask formally for Trinity to do this. But there's a lot of red tape dealing with Trinity. So at that time, I didn't want to do it, but maybe in the future, that's one more thing to try, because it would be very cool.
It would be amazing, because all this story about the enigma, I mean, this has been a topic that has, my audience has been very into it. They have been thrilled since the very first time I talked about this enigma that you talk about in Dracula el Origen. I talked about this topic in one of maybe the biggest podcast in Spanish about horror, here with a friend of mine, Fepo, Podcast Paranormal, and we reached hundreds of thousands of people on that show. And the following day that we had that live show, there was an event with some fans that had watched the episode the previous night, and they were all telling me, man, I didn't know that. I couldn't believe everything that you were saying, And the evidence, quote-unquote evidence that I showed on the program with my friend on this podcast was basically the everything that you put on that note at the end of Dracula. So it's like, I wanted to ask you, talking about all these characters and everything that you have told us. For example, this goes my theory. This is what I've always said about this on the show. So please, if I am mistaken, please correct me, because there's no better person to talk about this on the world than you, because you are like the key person, the researcher, the investigator that has been like revealing these things to the public. The theory that I have and how I've managed this story since like a year ago is that maybe in Dracula, in the novel Dracula, the original one, John Harker is Bram Stoker. That they are alias.
Yes. First of all, I agree right off the bat with you right there. You're on the right track. So keep going. You're doing great. I believe that myself.
That's what I want to know your point of view, because since I've been into this and I've been investigating with your notes, with some others that I'm gonna tell you about them a little bit in a minute. But what I believe is that John Harker per se never existed as John Harker because it was Bram Stoker. The character of Mina was not his wife, but his sister Matilda. Dr. Seward was Bram's brother, whose name I forgot right now. Sorry. Thornley Stoker. I always forget that name. Thornley is Dr. Seward, and Arminius Van Bury, that actually is a historical, very famous figure, is Van Helsing. And well, Ellen Crone doesn't appear in the Dracula that most of us have read, but she's in Powers of Darkness, which I'm going to talk a little bit about it a little bit in the future. But those are the characters that I can recognize about the real ones from the real life in the novel. Bram Stoker, Bram Stoker, John Harker, Mina, Matilda, Thornley, Dr. Seward, and Arminius Van Bury would be Van Helsing. So what do you think about this?
Absolutely. That's exactly why JD and I wrote the way we did. And this is one of the things I brought to JD. I said, look, I am convinced that these are all the characters. And as a writer, what you do is you write down characterization. When you have a co-author, you have to bring your story, you bring your outline, you bring everything you have to the guy you're going to work with. And that was part of my characterization. I say, this is Bram. Now, for your listeners, why is it Bram? Bram worked as a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department. He became an inspector of clerks all over Ireland. He traveled on train. He traveled on carriage. He would go to these different courts, 33 different counties in Ireland, like he's going to Munich, and have to bring papers to be signed and all this stuff, just like he is the count. The experience is going away from home and doing legal stuff. That's him. It's no question that's him. Matilda, so much like Mina, the modern woman. She's also an artist, but a little bit of the mother also. The mother was also obviously a feminist because she was advanced in her thinking and giving lectures. Renfield in Dracula is a character made up, but I believe Bram might have met somebody at the Hawkins law firm, a lawyer, because Bram did a lot of legal work for the Lyceum Theatre, not with the Hawkins law firm, but another one, Paxton. And so it makes sense. Now hear this out for a second, because we talked about all the real people. Thornley, yes, Dr. Seward. Let's get back to Renfield. Thornley was a doctor who did the same things as Seward, worked in a medical science with people doing physical problems, but also mental health problems. And that's exactly what Seward did. He's dealing with Renfield with his mental health problems, but also has the ability to do brain trephination surgery on Renfield, just like Thornley did. So let's get to Renfield, because the Stoker family, I believe, had very strong morals and thinking about people who were less fortunate than they were, people with mental health problems. So back in the Victorian era, late 1800s, people with mental health problems were put into prison. They were not treated. They were just stored away, get away from the problem. This time, when Bram was in London, they were beginning something called the Asylum Act, where they were beginning to build asylums. They still didn't know how to treat them very well, but they were beginning to realize they're not prisoners. They need some sort of compassion. They need pity. Thornley Stoker took the ideas of his mother, who gave a lecture as the only female ever allowed into the Social Inquiry Society in Dublin, which is for only men, to give a lecture about the proper way to take care of people that were deaf and mute. So again, mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
This was a Stoker issue. And I believe, when I tell you the next part, it will make sense. Thornley Stoker did brain surgery on people. Back in those days, they used to do surgery for education on dogs and monkeys. They used to cut off the top of the skull take it off, and with everyone watching in the medical school, they would touch different parts of the brain and see different parts of the person or dog or monkey move. Now, this was about 70 years after Frankenstein and the concept of galvanism, when the Italian Galvani put electricity to a dead frog and the frog moved, and they felt, oh, maybe we could reanimate people and put electricity to them. This is what stimulated Mary Shelley. But 70 years later, people were still mystified by how the brain worked. And there was a lot of this surgery going on, and in some cases, too much of it, because the dogs and the monkeys were suffering after the surgery. They were dying of infection. They were kept alive, and it was horrifying. So there was a move by the medical services to create a board of people to decide if this type of surgery, called vivisection, was needed. Was it necessary? And Thornley Stoker was one of these agents to get to apply for a license to do vivisection. And if you look carefully at the novel Dracula, Bram Stoker, with the help of his brother, got everything medical in the novel correct, from blood transfusion to the brain surgery on Renfield when he got beat up by Dracula and got the brain bleed. And they treated him with mercy and pity and tried to save him. But they portrayed Count Dracula as an evil scientist, not just a supernatural creature, but an evil scientist doing unnecessary experimentation on Renfield by forcing him to eat insects. So he was being looked at by Bram and his brother and society, as a reflection of the way the novel is written, as an evil scientist, just like Thornley was looking at these other evil scientists of their time. So that's, I believe, the Renfield is representative of the way people have been treating people with mental health problems. And if you treat them properly with pity and mercy and do the right type of surgery rather than the wrong type, this is how society should be.
Sure. Yeah, without a doubt. And Renfield is one of the most interesting characters. I would like to tell you very briefly, now that you mentioned Renfield, a couple of months ago, I received an email from a subscriber from Colombia. He asked me to remain anonymous and to keep anonymous some names, but short story long. This guy, well, he's now in his 40s, but he was in his 20s when he lived this 20 years ago in the early 2000s. He's an actor and a singer, so he was involved in an adaptation as an opera of Dracula, directed by and written by a very famous Colombian artist. And he was playing. He told me, he asked me not to tell which character he was playing, but it was one of the main bad characters, and we have only two bad guys on the Dracula novel, so you can make up which one was it. And the dark part of this was, in this adaptation, this artist put on, for example, Lilith, which is a very important mythical figure for the vampires, Lilith from the Old Testament. And it's not the same story as Dracula, it's an adaptation. And there are songs and music and, and he sent me the whole opera, which is like 2 hours long, more or less, and I watched it. He asked me not to put it completely yet on a video. I only shared some pieces of it with my audience. But the dark part is that the man that wrote the music for that opera, for that play, he went to like a secret dark library in a town in Colombia, like very, very, very secret, where they had like occult books and sorcery and all this stuff. And he literally took incantations and chantings to summon demons and dark entities, and he added those chantings into the opera. And it's actually very dark. It's actually very, very creepy, especially the numbers of this guy, the scenes, the songs with this guy, with this subscriber of mine, and the girl that was playing Lilith. It really sounds like a dark mass or something. And actually, dark things started happening to the actors of the stage. They were attacked by some entity. Well, what I believe it's an entity that in Spanish we call them incubos y sucubos, which is like incubus and succubus, which are like energetic vampires that are actually involved with Lilith, ironically. So very dark things started happening, and even the director's brother of the play, he told me that he was staying at the director's apartment in Colombia, and he woke up one night very late, like at 3 a.m. in the morning, because he heard noises in the balcony. He was like in a 10th floor, and he was by himself, the director's brother, and he was listening, to this, like if someone was in the balcony. So the first thing he thought was a thief, that someone wants to enter the house. So he went and he saw a man in the balcony, a very pale man in the balcony. He opened the door. The guy was not there anymore. He called his brother, the director, the play's director. He drove as fast as he could to the apartment because they both thought someone wanted to sneak in and rob or do something to the brother. When he arrived, no one was there. But there's no explanation how someone got into the.
How's he get away? Yeah, how's he get there and how's he escape?
Exactly, in a matter of seconds. So, and these, I mean, there are no witnesses of this, but the director have told the actors that when he started investigating all of this, there were some weird people, some strange people that approached him and told him that the real vampires were looking at him as he was investigating about them. So when this happened to his brother, he was like, okay, this guy or this thing that was in the balcony, that was one of the vampires that is looking after me. And even they say that when the play premiered, these guys were in the audience that night looking at the play.
Ooh.
So it's like a very dark story that if this guy hadn't sent me the play, maybe I wouldn't believe. But I was like, okay, there's something weird, and I connected it with everything that you have said, that you have written, that we have talked about. And so, Mr. Stoker, well, we have talked about Thornley, that he might be Dr. Seward, Bram Stoker might have been Jonathan Harker, and etc. Now, Ellen Cron, you have told us that she existed, that there is physical evidence that she existed, but and maybe this is like the main question that we'll have. What about Dracula? What are your thoughts based on what you have read about Bram Stoker? What are your thoughts on Dracula? Did he exist? Did not exist? How was the real version of him, if he was real?
Okay. Let's take this from a perspective of what did Bram know to start with. He was very aware of the myth of the vampire, not only in Transylvania, but I've seen the other treaties that people in Europe, but also in America, believed in the creatures that were coming out of the grave and taking life from the living, either physical or spiritual. Okay, that was something that was not just crazy stories. People believed it and were acting upon it. And acting, I mean exhuming graves, people of the church, military doctors involved. People believed this was happening, and they were observing people staking, doing these deviant burials to keep bodies in the ground. That's something that Bram mentioned in the one interview that he gave to Jane Stoddard. So we know that Bram was aware of the vampire myth. Now, did Bram believe it and see it? That part we don't know. I think he was open-minded about it because so many people did believe it. When Bram went about creating a physical manifestation for his book, number one, he needed a name. He needed a name that resonated to what I understand to be what was on Bram's mind, and that is the devil. He was very aware of the occult in society. He was very aware that religion, Protestantism, and Catholicism were always creating friction. He saw this in Ireland. He saw this when he came to England. And he realized that this was so powerful, that religion was powerful, but they still could not answer all the questions of the universe. So he began to think of something called pantheism. Pantheism is the understanding that all gods exist, above and below the ground, good and evil, that all of these things could exist, not just one. He was more open-minded about everything. Not to say that he was a devil worshiper, but he understood that people believe, therefore he exists. He also understood that the power of nature, of the sun, the moon, the stars, the ocean, and hell, heaven and hell, were very powerful, as he was recognizing the geological sciences of volcanoes and earthquakes. He knew that existed, and he saw this in books and papers. So I believe he was looking for a devil incarnate, a human version of the devil, to personify what was the most horrifying things, the creature that took the souls from either the living or those dead who are not resting in peace. So that's how he started looking for his devil name, and he found it in two books, Dracula. He found the book by William Wilkinson that mentioned Dracula means the devil. He found it by James Samuelson, where it says Vlad the Impaler was known as Dracula the Devil. So then he had a name, but he needed the imagery, and he had it right in front of him. Henry Irving, playing the role of Mephistopheles, the devil, in the play Faust for 20 years. So Bram was merging a physical image that people could identify with, because this was the famous Sir Henry Irving. This was his second most famous play. Something people could identify with, because they all were aware of religion, even though the power of religion was beginning to fall in England. As Charles Darwin had recently published The Origin of the Species, that was introducing the theories of evolution. So it wasn't just creation by God, and nobody would ask the question where and why, how and how much. They were asking what happens to our soul after we're dead. Is it possible that our physical body goes in the ground or gets burned into ashes and our spirit lives on and could come back in good or bad form? These are all issues weighing heavily on his mind. So this combination of all these things together, the devil, Dracula, spirit, the occult, everything merged together to make his Count Dracula. And that, I believe, is the answering the question, did Bram believe? How did he become? He needed something physical to represent the myth of the vampire. And since Transylvania had such a deep history of the occult and of superstitions, of vampires, of Strigoi, of Nosferatu, why not choose somebody from next door, Wallachia, and just move him to Transylvania to make a believable, creature who had a horrifying war-like history? So there we go.
I am reading Powers of Darkness, which I have understood that actually the edition that I am reading has a prologue by you. I forgot the name of the translator that's like the main translator of the book. I forgot it right now, but I'm gonna put here the cover so that people know. And let's talk a little bit about Power of Darkness. But there are some things that change, even names of the characters. And one of them is Dracula. It's not called Dracula in Powers of Darkness. It's called Draculits. So was it you read the original manuscript by Bram Stoker? Was it real? Was it first called Draculits? No. It was originally Dracula.
No. This will remain to be another mystery that is not yet solved. But both of these guys discovered this version of Dracula, one in a newspaper, two newspapers in Sweden, and the other in printed form and newspaper in Iceland in 1899, 1900, and 1901. Nobody, and they ran to me, have you found a manuscript just like the typescript that the Paul Allen estate owns? The answer is no. Nobody's ever found it. Nobody's ever found, and we have looked like crazy for a contract or any letters, any connection between Bram Stoker and Sweden and Iceland. And there are some friendships and so on, but no contracts or anything that show that there was a business transaction or the rights were allowed to be transferred. But that doesn't mean that the novel, and because we haven't found the contracts for many of the other books published in different countries, it doesn't mean that Bram didn't intend to have Dracula published in Sweden and Iceland. As a matter of fact, Bram's good friend, Hall Caine, a very famous author, more famous than Bram at his time, and the man that Dracula was dedicated to, Homi Beg, is Hall Caine. He published books in Iceland and had good friends with a publisher in Iceland, the same one that published Dracula. So it's a good chance that Bram did. But here's now my theory about what happened. Because it's been about, 7 or 8 years. And when they first came out, the possibility existed. Maybe Bram took his original manuscript, and since it was more, as you know, Mat Makraner is much more violent, it's longer, it is has more sex in it, and so maybe the British publisher was too stuffy to publish it in England. So Bram went to places that were a little more liberal. And the rules of the day were, you must have, this is true now, you must have your books published in the newspaper, one chapter at a time, before it can be published as a book. And this rule was in existence so that foreign authors had to give away their book for free before it could be published, so you could make money. And what was common of the day was editors of the newspapers would change the story to make it more attractive to what? Sell more newspapers. And if you look at the political climate of the day in Sweden, this was the beginning of the 1900s, when the rise of fascism was beginning to start in Europe and spreading towards Scandinavia. Look at Draculitz. He has a bearing to Hitler a little bit. And he does not come to England just to drink blood. He comes to England, sorry, spoiler alert, guys, to take over the government and to influence foreign ambassadors. Exactly the same role that fascism was doing in Europe. So I think now that I've had many years to reflect on this, listen to other scholars and look at other possibilities, that it was A.E., the man who signed one of the manuscripts, was, and I forget the name that De Roos and Edberg has come up with, Burkhorn, come up with, that this was a newspaper editor that added himself to the story as a promotional tool. And that Bram didn't write it that way because Bram himself was not a political, even though he had political feelings in his mind, he didn't write about them. Yeah, he didn't write about in his stories. None of his stories had real political overtones. They had social, they had ghostly, but not political. So that's how I feel Mat Makraner, Powers of Darkness, have come around. It's fascinating, and it's really cool to find this, but I don't think it was written by Bram.
Okay, so let me see if I got it right. So you think Makraner was partly the original story by Bram, but it was heavily manipulated in order to sell more newspapers by some anonymous editor whose name has been forgotten in my history. Is it?
Yes.
Am I right? Okay.
That's a good summary. Yes, that's what I believe.
And for example, because you said it yourself, there are a lot of characters, a lot of completely different scenes that we don't read in the regular Dracula version. And the one that really shocked me actually doesn't have to do anything with politics and all this stuff. It's all the scenes or the chapters with Dolingen von Graz and the love story that she has with Dracula, that she seems to start like falling in love with John Harker, and Dracula is kind of jealous, and he explains the story of his family, of her family. How did she get there? He gives a little summary of how they fell in love, she and Dracula. So and you handle this theory on the notes on Dracula that Dolingen von Graz was Ellen Kron, right?
Yeah, that's my theory. It works. As a writer, you take some license sometimes to switch things around. But since you're so knowledgeable, and I appreciate that, your readers need to understand that you should go, it's only in English, bramstoker.org is a free website. Go and read Dracula's Guest. Dracula's Guest is no question the original chapter 2 of Dracula. I found proof in the typescript of 6 places where things that happened in Dracula's Guest were crossed out of the typescript when, for some reason, 102 pages, chapters 1, 2, and 3 were taken out. It makes sense that, and I found references to things that I have a theory in chapter 1 and 3 as well, were also taken out. So Dolingen von Graz is a person that appears in Dracula's Guest. Our story, and this is what J.D. Barker and I did, being a prequel, Dracula the Origin is a prequel. It ended where Bram Stoker originally planned to start Dracula in that village of the damned outside of Munich. And that is the crypt containing Ellen Kron.
Okay. Yeah, I had a deja vu because you told me that the last time we talked with Antonio, and I was equally mind blown as I am right now. Well, we're almost getting to the end of this show. I wish we could have three more hours.
We can do another show sometime. Don't worry. I promise you this, because when I get a guy like you that asks great questions, listens well, we can do this more. Just not tonight though, but we'll do another one. Okay.
Thank you very much. Trust me, we will. This is just a teaser for my audience that I really love as well. Every time I upload a video talking about this, they really get into it, and they comment, and when I uploaded some clips of our interview with Antonio, they were all telling me, you have to get him into the podcast, only the two of you. So I know they will appreciate this, and thank you in their name. Maybe the last question that I have for you, Mr. Stoker, is, do you believe that Bram Stoker and his family went face to face with a force that was not human? Maybe not Dracula himself, maybe not a vampire, but do you believe they went one on one with a force of darkness once in their lives?
You know, Ireland, like Transylvania, is full of dark, mysterious spiritualism that emanate from hundreds of years ago. Bram Stoker and his family grew up in a country that stories are a way of life. And I think the family, when the stories are told of Abertacht, of Derdu, of banshees, the wailing dead, of fairies, of pukas, changelings, all these stories are so normal for them. And I know Mexico has similar, because you and I have chatted, and other people as well. Bram saw a book by Oscar Wilde's mother that was in his personal library. I saw the list of books in his personal library. I went and purchased that book from A Books, the same edition, and it said Irish folklore and mythology is very similar to that of Transylvania, as it contains werewolf and vampires, very similar to Ireland. So you're brought up in this. They believe these things because the stories are so bloody believable. It is also the home of Halloween, and not just in the way kids go and get candies and wear silly masks. A deep-rooted belief that as the seasonal change happens, the lightness and the dark of fall turning to winter, when the veil is lifted between the living and the undead, and the spirits come out and visit, good and bad spirits. And that's why people would wear masks and costumes, so they would hide from the spirits they want to hide from. This is centuries old. People believed it. So can I tell you that I've seen a journal or a diary that says, oh yes, we came face to face with a monster? No. But do I know honestly, and do I believe that the Stokers believed in it? The answer is yes. Because they were a spiritual group of people. They were Protestants, but they believed in the folklore that surrounded their countries. And this is why Bram Stoker included things like this in The Snake's Pass, in The Virgin's Embrace, in Mystery of the Sea, in The Jewel of Seven Stars. So he understood that this existed in his own country, and he knew it existed in other places in the world, and wrote stories about it because it was commonplace, and he knew to make it seem real would make the stories more readable.
It's very interesting that you tell us that, because I hadn't focused on this topic from that point of view, that maybe Dracula himself doesn't exist. But, well, maybe he didn't exist, but something that he was the representation of something else, something more powerful that might have or not, or might not be, in Bram Stoker's life. But that because, for example, I didn't know that, and I read it from you that Bram Stoker asked to be I don't know how is it said in English,
cremated,
to not become a non-living, right? A vampire, and it's I have understood that practice was not very popular 127 years ago. Maybe today, because we're running out of space to dig our deaths.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
But in that time, it was not very common, and so yeah, I'm gonna keep with that focus of maybe Dracula was not real per se, but something similar or something that he was the representation of. And
let me ask you this: if you took that question, and we don't have time to go into this, so it's not fair. God, as we know it, how do you know he's real? Because people believe it. Can you touch him? Can you come face to face? But you can believe it. It represents goodness. It represents what? As opposed to Dracula represents evil and spiritual and souls of the dead. So it's interesting question that you say this. Just because you can't touch and feel doesn't make it believable. And if it's believable, is it real? So
exactly. Yeah. That's like the focus that mankind has been trying to solve since we started writing and talking, right?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
And I would like to talk about that on our next meeting someday. Let's hope it's soon, because I am also a writer myself, and this year came out the book that I wrote when I was 20. Right now I'm 26. And the title is Mexicanthropos versus Vampiros, which is something like Mexican lycanthropes versus vampires. And the funny thing that I've talked about, that many people, they don't believe me, but when I started writing that book, I hadn't read Dracula, and I hadn't even watched the movie Francis Ford Coppola's, which is like the most popular one. And I added a lot of scenes in the book that they are identical to some Dracula scenes, but I hadn't read the book and I hadn't watched the movie. So I was like very like, okay, maybe I thought it was a coincidence, or maybe there's something else like we have in our brain, I don't know. But
where do these thoughts come from?
Exactly. Like if he was a heritage from our ancestors or something of a very ancient predator. And when you would talk to me about the Sholamans and that it was the devil who taught Dracula, who turned him to a vampire, that I want to talk about that in the future with you in depth. Very, very funny. I didn't know that until the last time we talked, which was like in March. This book, I wrote it 4 years ago, and the creature or the entity, because it's like the representation of the devil. I am an atheist, but I do believe that there are like a power of good and a power of evil in the universe. And this entity, this character that I made up for the story, is like the representation of the devil, and that entity is the one that turns my Dracula into the first vampire in the world. So when you told me about the legend of the Sholamans and the devil and all that stuff, I was like, holy cow.
I did the same thing without knowing this. Yeah, good for you. That's cool.
I was like, I mean, maybe there's something, as you say, that we might know from other times, from our ancestors, and that we get it to recognize it a little bit. I don't know. I want to believe that, but it's funny at least.
It is. It's good to talk about. Listen, it's been wonderful to be on the show. Thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for good questions. So let's just say until next time, we'll keep thinking of cool things, and we'll come up with some good discussion points for the next show.
Of course, Mr. Stoker. Thank you for this great talk, and see you next time. We'll be in touch.
Okay. All right. Take care now. Bye-bye.